It started with a garment bag that had been pushed into a place where nothing is ever stored, not hung, not tagged, not logged on any wardrobe sheet in that building, wedged into the gap between a wall and an old campaign trunk behind a dressing screen in a room where every other item had a printed label with a date and an occasion on it, and the person who found it was not looking for it, she was looking for a pen. Now, I'm going to hold what was inside that bag for a few minutes because the shock of it only works once you understand who was hours away from putting it on and what it would have meant if the cameras had caught her in it. Stay with me on this one. It turns on a single object, and the object is one of the most protected pieces of fabric in this country. If you like the stories where somebody very junior does the right thing and blows the whole thing open, take a second and subscribe, because that is exactly what happened here. Quick word before we go further. I'm Harold. I spend my time going through the inventories, the custody records, the loan papers, and the small print that moves around this family. The documents that exist precisely so that nobody can ever claim afterwards that a thing was borrowed rather than taken. And what you are about to hear is me putting the pieces together the way I read them. Stay with me to the end because the last object anybody noticed in that room is the one that tells you what was really being planned. By the time we finish, you will know what was in that bag. You will know who signed the order that stopped it. You will know why a serving officer put his shoulder into a wardrobe in a royal residence. And you will know about the suitcase in the corner that nobody in the coverage has mentioned once. Let me take you into Clarence's house the night before because that is where it starts, and it starts with a woman almost nobody has heard of. The chandeliers had already been dimmed for the evening. Elsie Grafton had been a junior chamber attendant for 3 years, which means she is the person who checks that tomorrow's clothes are where tomorrow's clothes are supposed to be, and she knew the routine well enough to do it half asleep. The press team had sent through their requirements for the following day, and the wording is worth hearing because everything that follows sits underneath it. Something visually commanding, something with gravitas for the step and repeat photographs. Quick note before we continue. Everything I dig up that doesn't make it into these videos, I put into a free weekly letter. Join more than 10,000 royal present. Beige gloves for the garden greeting. Present. Everything tagged. Everything hanging where it should hang. Everything accounted for. And then she dropped her pen. It rolled behind the dressing screen into the one part of that room a person cannot reach without going down on their hands and knees. And she went down after it. Her fingers found the floor, then the base of an old campaign trunk, and then something that had no business being where it was, a garment bag, long, heavy in the middle, and visibly older than every other thing in that immaculate room. She should have left it. She knew she should have left it. But there was dust on the velvet cover in a room where nothing is ever allowed to gather dust, and the bag had not been stored back there. It had been pushed back there, which is a different verb, and everybody who works in a house like that knows the difference. Then she saw the emblem on the upper corner, a crown encircled by laurel, and beneath it embroidered in gold thread gone dull with age. For characters, her too, Elizabeth Regina too. Her hands were not steady when she pulled the zip down a few inches, enough to see what was inside. And what was inside was a cascade of crimson velvet, heavy as a theater curtain, with gold oak leaves worked into the border, catching what little light came through the gap. She had seen fabric like that exactly twice in her life, and both times it was in a photograph of an event that happened decades before she was born. Now, here is where a lot of people in that job would have made a very different decision, and I want to give this woman her due because her entire career depended on the next. She could have zipped it back up, shoved it behind the trunk, finished her shift, and gone home. Nobody would ever have 5 minutes known. The safest thing anybody can do inside a royal household is to see nothing, and every person who works in one learns that in the first month. She did the opposite. She zipped it closed, lifted it out from behind the screen, and laid it carefully on the ottoman in the middle of the room in plain sight where whoever came in next would have to look at it. Then she went out into the corridor and made a phone call she was almost certainly not supposed to make. Royal Collection Elsie Grafton at Clarence's house. There is a garment here with ER2 markings, crimson velvet, gold embroidery, and it is scheduled to be worn tomorrow. Later, an encrypted alert was sitting on a secure console at Windsor. By sunrise, it had gone considerably further than that, and a sealed envelope was on its way across London to a barracks addressed to a man who had never in 8 years received anything with that level of urgency attached to it. And I want you to understand why a piece of clothing sets off that kind of chain. Because from the outside, it looks absurd. It is a coat, because from the outside, it looks absurd. absurd. It's a coat. But inside Clarence's house that night, nobody was laughing. Within minutes of Elsie's call, the photograph of the crimson garment had reached a secure desk, and by the time the first light began appearing over London, someone had already ordered the dressing room sealed. The instruction was simple: nobody touches the garment, nobody moves the campaign trunk, and nobody asks questions outside the people who absolutely need to know. Elsie was still in the staff corridor when a man in a dark suit appeared. She had never seen him before. He stopped beside her and asked, "Is the dressing room secure?" She said yes. Then he asked the question that made her uncomfortable. "Has anyone entered since you left?" Elsie shook her head. The man nodded and walked away without another word, but something about him bothered her. He hadn't come to investigate the garment. He seemed to already know it was there. Inside the room, the crimson velvet remained on the ottoman exactly where Elsie had placed it, but beside it was something she hadn't noticed before: a small white card. No crest, no department name, no signature. Just 3 words printed in black ink: for heritage appearance. Elsie stared at the card because those words were almost identical to the language used on the original wardrobe request. Then she noticed a tiny number in the corner. 17. She had no idea what it meant, but somewhere else in London, someone did. At a military facility, a duty officer was reviewing the photographs sent from Clarence's house. He asked where the garment had been found. Behind a campaign trunk. He asked whether it had been logged. The answer was no. That was the moment the officer stopped treating the incident as a wardrobe mistake. He ordered the custody records brought to him. The file contained records for hundreds of historic items, but there was no crimson garment matching the description. No transfer, no loan, no restoration, no storage entry, nothing. That was impossible. A significant ceremonial garment couldn't simply appear inside a royal residence without a record. Someone had either bypassed the entire system or deliberately removed the evidence that the garment had ever existed there. The officer looked at the wardrobe schedule again. The garment wasn't merely stored in the room. It had been scheduled to be worn the following day. That changed everything. Before the cancellation order could reach Clarence's house, another man arrived at the residence carrying a black case. His identification was accepted at the staff entrance, even though his name wasn't on the original visitor list. He walked directly toward the dressing room as though he knew exactly where to go. When he entered, he stopped in front of the crimson velvet. He didn't touch it immediately. Instead, he put on white gloves and carefully lifted the fabric. Beneath the velvet was another label, much older than the first. The man read it and suddenly froze. His expression changed from professional to alarmed. He placed the garment back down and called someone. "Cancel the appearance." The voice on the phone replied, "Already cancelled." "No," he said, "you don't understand." He looked at the crimson fabric again. "This isn't the garment." For several seconds there was silence. Then the voice asked, "Then what is it?" The man didn't answer, because he had just realized the velvet wasn't the important object. It was a covering. Something had been hidden beneath it, or something had been transported inside it. He turned toward the old campaign trunk and began examining it. At the bottom of the trunk was a small metal plate. One number was engraved into it. 17, the same number as the card. He crouched down and shone a light underneath the trunk. That's when he saw it. A suitcase. Small, black, locked. Nobody had mentioned it in the original report. Not Elsie, not security, not the wardrobe team, nobody. He pulled it forward and examined the lock. 3 tiny scratches had been made beside it. They looked random at first, but they weren't. 1, 7, 3. He entered the numbers. The lock clicked. Inside was a single folder and one old photograph. The photograph showed a woman standing beside the same crimson velvet covering. The image looked decades old. On the back were 5 handwritten words: "Never wear this in public." The man stared at the photograph. He recognized the woman. And that was when the situation became much more serious. She wasn't a member of the royal family. She was a former officer whose name had disappeared from public records years earlier. The man immediately called the archive. "Open the old files," he said. The voice asked, "Which files?" He looked again at the photograph. "Anything connected to number 17. Meanwhile, Elsie was sitting alone in a staff room. Nobody had told her what was happening. At 5:06, a senior official entered and closed the door behind him. He asked her to repeat everything she had seen. The pen, the dressing screen, the campaign trunk, the garment bag, the crimson velvet, the gold embroidery, the label. Then he asked, "Did you photograph it?" "No." "Did you remove anything?" "No." "Did you tell anyone?" Elsie hesitated. "I made one call." The official looked at her carefully. "To whom?" "I don't know." For the first time, his expression softened. "Then you may have done exactly the right thing." Elsie asked if she was in trouble. He shook his head. "No. You may have stopped something." At 6:12, the wardrobe schedule was changed. The crimson garment disappeared from the official plan. Another outfit was selected. The press team was given a simple explanation, a last-minute styling change. But at 6:41, another message arrived. Do not remove the suitcase. That instruction confused everyone. Why leave a hidden suitcase inside a royal dressing room? Unless the suitcase wasn't evidence. Unless it was bait. The officer finally understood the possibility. The garment, the card, the number 17 and the suitcase may not have been separate discoveries at all. They could have been pieces of a sequence designed to lead someone from one object to another. And whoever created that sequence had made one mistake. They hadn't expected Elsie to find the garment early. They expected someone to discover it later. They expected it to be worn. Instead, a junior attendant had moved it into plain sight and made one phone call. By sunrise, whatever had been planned for the next day had already collapsed. But the story wasn't over. At 7:03, another envelope arrived at Clarence's house. Inside was one sheet of paper. At the top was the number 17. Below it was a date, then a name, and underneath the name was a handwritten sentence. Elsie read it once, then again. Her face changed, because the sentence suggested that the crimson garment wasn't connected to a ceremony at all. It was connected to something that was never supposed to be remembered. And suddenly the question wasn't, who put the garment there? The question was much worse. Who wanted someone to wear it? Because if the cameras had captured that crimson velvet the following morning, it wouldn't simply have been a strange wardrobe choice. It would have connected the royal household to an event that official records said never happened. And there was still one object nobody had properly searched, the campaign trunk. Because beneath the floor beside it was a narrow wooden panel. And behind that panel was another compartment. A compartment containing something far older than the garment. Something carrying a royal seal. Something dated years before the crimson velvet was supposed to have been made. And when the officer finally saw what was inside, he understood why the person who planned the entire operation had used the number 17. It wasn't a room number. It wasn't a file number. It was a date. And that date was about to change the entire story.